Hello everyone, my name's Dr. Fergal Armstrong and welcome to Lifestyle Matters with Dr. Savina. Hello Savina, how are you?
Good, thanks Fergal, and yourself?
I'm very well. So I thought today we'd have a general chit chat around diet and how diet applies to lifestyle medicine. So we're not going to delve deep into any one particular diet, we're just going to kind of give a gentle introduction. So my first question to you is, to what extent does diet influence health?
And that's a very good question, because we've talked about that several times about, how, diet accounts for nutrition, accounts for about 80% of, for example, weight loss, and how it plays such a huge role in chronic disease prevention. Exercise generally accounts for the remainder of it. And lots of us, as we've pointed out before, you love saying it, Fergal, you can't exercise your way out of a bad diet. That's your favorite catchphrase, isn't it?
No, you cannot.
So I think this is going to be a great, video, because we're going to be talking about the biggest part about, preventative health, which is our diet.
Exactly. And I'm reminded of one of the Greek philosophers that said, let your food be your medicine and your medicine be your food. And I cannot think of a better way of describing the core role, the crux that diet provides for the whole of lifestyle medicine. And you've mentioned that it helps with weight loss, but diet and the right kind of diet is essential for the prevention and management of, heart disease, stroke, depression, cancer, joint pains. I cannot, in all honesty, I'm not sure I can think of any one particular medical condition that cannot be positively impacted by the right kind of diet. Would you agree with that? Or can you think of even one diagnosis?
Well, not really. In fact, there's lots of trials that are also being carried out about diet and, disease prevention, like some of the diseases that you've discussed, which we will be diving into in the later episodes. But there's such great emphasis on it because everyone's realized the importance of it.
So if you had to summarize the diet that we as lifestyle physicians advise in one sentence, what would you say?
Okay, so that's a very hard one. I think whatever diet that we end up choosing needs to be something that you can actually sustain. It needs to be a sustainable diet. There's no point doing a diet that you can do, for 3 months or 6 months or a year even, if you can sustain it, but then not carry on after that. And that's where I think most of the failures happen, when it's not a sustainable diet. So what would your basic advice be around diets, Fergal?
So I say to people that if they can't, if they don't want to go into the minutiae of diet, I say, look, any diet that you do has to be sustainable. And we as lifestyle physicians recommend a whole food, plant-based diet that minimizes junk food, processed foods. So then that then usually stimulates a discussion on, well, what exactly is a whole food? What is a plant-based diet? So Savina, what are whole foods and what are plant-based diets?
So for whole foods are basically as simply as, imagining where your food's coming from. So if you can, imagine an apple, it's fallen from a tree and it's arrived, a few steps between and it's arrived at your plate. That would be a whole food. So, your fresh fruits and vegetables would be one of them, whole grains, things that have been least amount of process that's happened to them, really. That would be what I would classify as whole foods. And obviously plant-based diet would be plant-based foods, really, and minimizing the amount of meat intake, especially red meat.
Yeah. So we know that actually processed meat is a class one. According to the World Health Organization, processed meat is a carcinogen. And we know that actually red meat is known to increase your risk of cancer, especially of the bowel. So yes, we do need to minimize our consumption of red meat, and there are health benefits to actually substituting red meat with other kinds of foods. But overall, plants are medicines. This is what I say to people. The more plants, the more vegetables that you eat, the more of the pill, the more of the lifestyle pill you're taking, the more of the weight loss pill you're taking.
So lots of my female patients, when I advocate for a plant-based diet, they talk about, the fact that they need to eat red meat to get their iron because lots of them suffer with iron deficiency. What would your advice be around that, Virgo?
Well, with the right kind of balance in your diet, you don't actually need to eat meat to get iron. And so we know that actually spinach, gram for gram, spinach has got more iron in it than red meat. Gram for gram. So, we wouldn't think of twice about eating a 300 gram steak, would you? But, would you really eat 300 grams of spinach? But, so that's one thing. You need to have a rich and varied diet, which includes a lot of green, leafy greens. So, vegetables like spinach and kale, these are very high in iron content. And the second thing is we need to actually try and increase the amount that is absorbed. And we know that the iron in vegetables is less easily absorbed than the iron in red meat. And so we need vitamin C in our diets to actually help absorb the plant-based iron, much more easily. So with those two things in mind, I believe that it is perfectly reasonable for people not to have to eat meat to maintain normal iron. But there are always people when we provide consultations, Savina, both you and I do see people with iron deficiency syndromes. And, the question is, if you're seeing someone with an iron deficiency syndrome, would you tell them to eat more steak, or would you treat that problem with investigations of why they're losing iron and then possibly oral supplementation or even intravenous supplementation? I think that lifestyle medicine plays a significant part in how I manage my patients, but it doesn't exclude the possibility of, pills. What would you say to that, Savina?
Yeah, I would say, it comes down to really how bad their iron deficiency is, and if they're symptomatic or not, and how far aggressive I would treat them. I would, if it's a mild deficiency, then obviously we'll try lifestyle first, so dietary changes and things. And obviously, if that's a bit lower, then we talk about the medications and infusions that you've described.
But another thing to think about in terms of red meat is everyone thinks, people who say to me, oh, look, what about the iron in red meat? Isn't that healthy? Another way of thinking about it is gram for gram, the more red meat we eat, the higher our risk of diabetes it becomes. Heme iron and the consumption of heme iron is positively correlated with the incidence of diabetes. So, it's also correlated with the risk of cancer. So red meat is not the panacea for all our ills. I'm not saying don't eat meat. I'm saying eat it in moderation, and I'm saying be aware of the established risks.
And it's not just cancer, is it? Saturated fats and things that you get from red meat too. Yeah. That's where I struggle when. Yeah.
Well, again, if we're moving on to the saturated fat argument, even chicken breast, right? Chicken breast without the skin, where there's no fat on it, still contains 23% saturated fat. Right?
That's a lot.
That's a lot. So the bottom line is meat contains saturated fat. And if we actually look at, the average cholesterol in people who have various kinds of diet, there is actually a progression of a descending amount of LDL depending on how vegetarian the diet becomes. And this is important because we know that if your total cholesterol is less than 3.8 millimoles, or I don't know what that is, I think that might be 150 milligrams per deciliter in American units, but if your total cholesterol is less than 3.8, you will not have progression of coronary artery disease. If your LDL is less than 1.8, you are unlikely to have progression of coronary artery disease. So it's really important to consider the need to reduce these parameters, and diet is one way of doing it. So we know that omnivores on average, now bearing in mind that there's a wide range to this, omnivores on average have an LDL of 3.2. Lacto-ovo-vegetarians, i.e. people who eat dairy, people who eat eggs, have an average of an LDL of
2.6.
2.6, and then lacto-vegetarians, so people who eat dairy but don't eat eggs, have a LDL of
2.26.
And then vegans have an LDL of
About 1.8.
1.8. So the average vegan has an LDL that is at the level at which you will not get progression of coronary artery disease.
But that's not easy, is it, to achieve?
Look, I'm not telling people to become vegan, but people who choose veganism as a lifestyle, as a diet, are known to have low LDL. So if you've got a disease process that is the progression of which is dependent on LDL, well, becoming a vegan, or at least trying to reduce your meat content in your diet, is beneficial.
Definitely. But yeah, as you said, not everyone can be a vegan. It's not actually an easy diet. Have you tried it, Vogel? I tried. It was hard.
I tried once. I lasted a day.
Yeah, but speaking of veganism, since we're talking about that, I have actually found that, and with having a vegan diet, you can do it in a healthy way, or you can do it in an unhealthy way. And there are some vegans who actually eat quite a lot of processed versions of vegan food, and that actually comes with a lot of added salt and preservatives and things like that. So just because if someone listens to this and say, I'm going to become a vegan, just be wary about the choices we make. So it still comes down to what we were starting off, whole food, plant-based diet. So that's basically the crux of it, I reckon.
Veganism is not entirely healthy because chips and beer are vegan. But if you eat too many chips and beer, you're going to have problems, aren't you?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. But I guess it comes down to, in the end, how we started off saying any diet will work for as long as it's sustainable. But the idea is that, if we actually look at other factors, what other factors might we actually look at when we're trying to pick a diet for ourselves?
Well, there's a lot said about all the various types of dietary patterns, right? And I think before we go into specific diets, specific dietary patterns, and matching them up to specific diseases, I think there's a couple of basic principles. There's a lot of competition, right? Some people advocate, vegetarian diets. Some people advocate high fat, high protein diets, low carb diets. And there's been a lot of toing and froing and arguing about which is the better kind of diet. And Savina, is there evidence of superiority for any one particular diet over another diet, as far as you're aware?
I think when it comes down to certain medical conditions, which we would talk about, in terms of research, there are certain diets that would, tick off a couple of extra boxes. But in the end, I think they're all pretty much on the same playing ground, if they're sort of sticking to the same idea of the whole food, minimizing preservatives, minimizing red meat. There's a lot of, the same things, the same tunes that they're singing, just a few tweaks here and there, essentially. That's what I've found by reading with all the different diets. In the end, it's about reducing your calorie intake. And what we find is that when you start reducing your calorie intake, your basal metabolic rate also reduces. And that's when people actually start getting, I suppose, hitting a plateau. So, how when we start following a diet, sometimes we might be doing, having massive weight loss. And then after a few months down the track, or several months down the track, depending on your body, we might hit a plateau. And then that's when it comes back down to, making some changes for your body to adapt to this new calorie deficit in whatever way you might want to entail. Doing that either may be changing what you're eating or exercising a little bit more to cause that calorie deficit.
Yeah, I actually recommend exercise to punch through that plateau. So as you rightly say, once you've lost 10% of your body weight, it's actually your body becomes more efficient at actually moving. So you basically burn fewer calories. And
lots of people actually think when they hit the plateau, it's actually a failure. I'm not sure if you've met people who say they've tried and they failed, but it's actually not a failure, is it, Fogel?
No, it's not. It's not. It's a physiological process that needs to be identified, recognized, and managed. And for me, it's a trigger to discuss exercise and fasting. They're particularly good ways of breaking through that plateau. So diets for me, it doesn't really matter which diet you go for because there's good evidence they all work the same basically for 12 months. And then beyond that, the evidence the becomes a bit more murky for, low carb versus vegetarianism, etc., etc. But if you've got specific conditions, you may want to choose a specific diet. So Savina, how do you go about choosing a diet for a particular person? What are the factors you consider?
Okay, so I guess it comes back to when I was talking the main thing, what is sustainable for the person. So it comes down to, for example, very simple cultural differences. Like, for example, me being Indian, there's certain foods that I might enjoy eating. That's something you want to take into account. An Italian might have certain foods they want to eat, which might not suit a diet that they choose. So cultural factors is one of the big thing. Family, the rest of the family members that you're cooking for, are they going to be adaptable to this change that you are planning to implement? You're not going to be spending time cooking one diet for yourself and another diet for the rest of the family. So finding a diet that suits the entire family is another factor that I would look at. And also coming with that would be social support. So, if you've got friends or family who are all in the same boat and they're supportive of this plan, you're more likely to succeed with that diet. Yeah. Another factor would be cost. Some diets, and I find, and this is a joke that I sometimes make with my patients, going to Macca's and buying a Big Macca's meal is much cheaper than going and buying, healthy foods from the supermarket. But, you've got to think about the long-term cost, on your health impact. You've got to think about that too. But eating healthy is not exactly the cheapest, but there are different diets that can cater for, someone on a smaller budget. In terms of that. Any underlying medical conditions, which we will talk about in the next episode with, the Mediterranean diet, portfolio diet, another thing. And the last factor I would talk about is genetics. Have you heard about nutrigenomics, Virgo?
Well, I've heard the term, but I don't really understand it. So would you care to explain that one to us?
Yeah, look, I think it's an evolving field. There are people who specialize in that area, and it's really a new field where they're actually looking at how our body responds to certain foods. Just like, for example, pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics, like, how drugs in our body interact with each other. The same thing, they're looking at how food interacts with our body and how our body interacts with the food. And, potentially this may have some role down the track, maybe in, a few decades time, but it's an interesting field. I myself don't know much about it. I know the basis of it. It's quite interesting to see how it will evolve, because just a quick example, keto diet works really well for some, but for some, it actually can end up causing lots of troubles with cholesterol and liver failure. And I've seen that firsthand in my patients too. So, and I think that comes down to genetics.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing then is, look, you've got to be a little bit careful in choosing the diet, because not every diet works for every individual. There is variation in life.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But
so on that sweet note, I think we'll end it here, and in the next episode we'll go through the diet disease matrix, and we'll try and match up some conditions with some diets.
Great. Thanks very much, Virgo.
That's all for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.